I am James Fallows of The Atlantic. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be able to spend these next few minutes with the former Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson. You all know him. I'll just say a word about his background before we get to the questions. You know he was Secretary of the Treasury during the last 3 years of the George W. Bush administration in the middle of world crisis. Wrote a great book called On the Brink about that experience. Former chairman and CEO of Goldman Sachs. Now the founder and chairman of the Paulson Institute in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, right? A distinguished athlete, a former All-Ivy and honorable mention All-American lineman at Dartmouth back in the 1960s, a lifelong conservationist, and somebody who's been extremely generous personally now and in the future too with his commitments in conservation efforts around the world, in North America, South America, and China. We'll talk about that too. He is expert in several of the themes that run through all of our discussions here. The financial prospects in the U.S., between the U.S. and China, evolutions in China, and the environmental prospect for the entire world. So I look forward to these few minutes we have ahead. We're going to start talking first about China itself, where Secretary Paulson is one of the most experienced Americans from the business or governmental community in our history, I would think. You know the new leadership that's just come into China. How should we think about this new regime and what they offer for their country and the world?
Well, what you should think is, first of all, they're strong leaders. Xi Jinping is cut from a different mold stylistically. He doesn't give long, boring speeches where he reads. He speaks, on an impromptu basis. He's done away with some of the trappings of power. He's done things like said the military will no longer serve hard liquor at their dinners, and the liquor companies have their stocks fall dramatically, etc. He's also someone who I believe wants a very good relationship with the United States, and he's someone who I believe is an economic reformer. He is running a standing committee, which is smaller. It's 7 rather than 9, and they're much more united. 5 of the members of the standing committee are term limited, so they're more into getting things done, and it'll only be Xi and Li Keqiang that will be presumably there for 10 years. So he understands also the important role the private sector needs to play. That's the good news. The bad news is he needs to be a strong leader because this country has a lot of challenges. And Jim and I were talking beforehand, never have I seen expectations so high. The Chinese people, there's a lot riding on his shoulders, and it's going to be difficult for him to fulfill all of those expectations given the nature of the challenges.
So I was in Beijing a couple of weeks ago, as I was mentioning, I was asking university students, government officials, business people, what would be their markers of the Xi era being a success or not a success in terms of reforms they'd want to see in 4 or 5 years. 5 years from now, if you look back and say, oh yes, he accomplished this and that means it's working, or he didn't do that and that means the system is too rigid, what will be the markers you'll look for?
Well, a number of things. The of all, they really need to reinvigorate economic reform. No doubt about it. The current economic model is really running out of steam. And that's a lot easier said than done. So there's a whole list of things they need to do. I would say, if I would just say it most simply, that they need to rely more on markets and the private sector and less on government administrative controls. They need to continue the reform of the state-owned enterprises, have them compete on a level playing field. They need to place much less reliance on economic growth that stems from government investment in infrastructure and much less reliance on exports. They need to grow their economy domestically faster. They need to reform their capital markets. So there's a lot they need to do there, but that's just the economic side. He has to make progress on corruption, which is a huge point of contention with the Chinese people. He needs to make progress in the environmental area because they're angry about the dirty water and dirty air, so they need to make progress there. And I think lastly, and as importantly as anything else, is they need to improve governance, transparency, the rule of law, because without the rule of law, they're not going to be successful in terms of what they want to do economically and politically over the long term. And the country is so big and so complex now, and it's essentially, the reason I've gone to China so much, it's a country that's sort of ruled by men as opposed to laws, and so its relationships are very important. And so to build those institutions and strengthen the rule of law, which I'm sure he's committed to do, those are some big challenges.
There's a very intense argument that I'm sure you know about, and many people in this audience probably do too, but Americans in general don't pay much attention to. I think many Americans assume that China is just this runaway success and it has no problems whatsoever. You know, there's a deep argument about whether the nature of the system needs to change, if it's going to take the next step up in its economic development, not just be a sort of outsourcing place, but a truly rich country. Tell us about that argument and how you think it will unfold.
Well, I think Jim, that's the perfect question, because what I said needs to be done, I think, is what most economic reformers believe. I believe it is what Xi Jinping believes. It's what Li Keqiang, the premier, believes. But these are difficult to do. So what is the scope of the reforms? How do you sequence the reforms? This is difficult. And then there's strong vested interests that will oppose reforms. You know, totally different country than ours, obviously, and a different political system. But in many ways, we have a common question or problem. Are the governments going to be able to get this done in the wake of the vested interests that are going to be opposing reform? And so there are those in the country that don't think you should change the economic model. There are those in the country that don't think you should have a constructive relationship with the United States. They believe the United States is trying to, hold China down. But again, I think this is a president that enjoys right now widespread support. I've never seen anything quite like it.
I have one or two questions about U.S.-China relations before we come to the very interesting work you and your institute are doing there now. A number of the other sessions at this conference, the issue of cybersecurity, cyber theft, cyber hacking has come up, with China cast in the role as the main malefactor here. How do you think Americans should understand this issue? What should China do? What should the U.S. do to try to address it?
Well, so the huge issue that the U.S. government is focused on, and rightfully so, I think, is the concern that it is totally unacceptable to have a foreign government or foreign companies collecting information, intellectual property, trade secrets from private companies in the U.S. That's very different from one government collecting information about another. And so the thing that is just so essential to restoring and building trust in the economic area is that issue. It's not just a national security issue, it is an economic security issue, and we need to find common ground with China on that. And if we do, I think that will open up more opportunities for Chinese companies in the U.S. Now, this is a very confusing issue, because when you talk about cyber and cyber crimes, it goes all the way from war to terrorism to the anarchists to sabotage to crime. And when you look at the perpetrators, you've got everything from governments to terrorists, to the anarchists. So there's just a whole range. And this is an area, like many areas, where the technology has moved much quicker than the infrastructure and the ways of dealing with it. We don't have adequate laws in the United States today. Many countries don't. And globally, we don't have the proper protocols and norms of behavior. So it's just essential we find common ground here. And I really questioned the extent to which our global economic system can hold together longer term if we don't make some real progress here. And so this is an area that the Obama administration is focused on, and it's going to be on the agenda for the Security and Economic Dialogue. Now, it became much, much more complex as a result of this Snowden problem. And so that's been very, very harmful and muddied and confused the waters. And it's confusing enough in China because unlike the U.S., China's companies are a mixture of government-owned, state-owned companies and the private sector. The private sector is where the future is, as far as I'm concerned, and where the growth is going to come from and the jobs and the innovation. But you've got this mixture, which again tends to muddy the area. So, good question, because if you would say to me, I'm optimistic about the U.S.-China relations for a number of reasons, more so than I have been in a while. But I think if you say, what's the one area that could really derail it, it's the cyber area.
Right, and also it alienates the parts of the U.S. Sort of power structure that would naturally be most sympathetic to Chinese engagement, for example, tech companies and all the rest. One other question about U.S.-China relations. My inference after living in China for a while is that most people there mainly care about China, not other countries, and their default attitude towards the United States is either neutral or positive. Towards Japan, it's strongly negative, the default attitude. Many Americans who have not spent time there think that finally China must have something bigger in mind relative to the United States. They must finally want to take over in some way. How do you respond to that kind of question?
I believe that the Chinese have had their hands full for a long time in terms of the challenges they have in their economy and in their country. And so I look at it, I go to China a lot because I'm a patriot. I want what's best for the U.S. And so I look at this U.S.-China relationship and I say, I can't find many issues in the world, big important issues that aren't going to be easier to solve if we work together and aren't going to be more difficult to solve if we don't work together. And if China has problems, it's going to impact us in a number of ways. Now, I believe we need to be tough, and I think that there's no doubt we need to be strong economically, militarily, diplomatically, and we need to be strong in Asia. But the biggest concerns I have are not what's going on in China. The biggest concerns I have are what's not going on here in terms of fixing our economy and restoring economic strength and so on.
Yeah. So let's talk now about some of the work you're doing through your institute and your own private efforts. As we've read, hundreds of millions of people have moved to Chinese cities over the last couple of decades. Hundreds of millions of more will do that. The environment and sustainability in all its dimensions is, at least in my view, the major challenge for China's future and for its impact on the world. Tell us about your vision and your efforts on sustainability in China in the broadest sense.
Right. Well, Jim, as you said, what I've done is set up an institute, the Paulson Institute. We have 4 or 5 people in Beijing, 4 or 5 in Washington, a number in Chicago. It's the Paulson Institute at the University of Chicago, but it's focused on U.S.-China relations because I think that is the most important bilateral relationship. And it's a think and do tank, and it is, again, our major focus is sustainable economic growth globally and a clean environment. And I believe those two things are not at odds with each other. They can and must go hand in hand. So then why China? Because when you look at the U.S. and China, we're the 2 largest economies, right? We're the 2 largest users of energy. We're the 2 largest emitters of carbon. So we've got all sorts of reasons why we should work together. And if we don't, it's hard to believe we are going to get anything like an optimal outcome or be able to deal with these challenges. And again, as I look at it, China's got, as we talked about, these serious economic challenges, these environmental challenges. If they solve them in a constructive way, this is good for us. If they don't, it isn't good for us. And so what we do is have a number of programs. You mentioned urbanization. That was our first program, but we work hard there because there are going to be, over the next 15 or 20 years, another 300 million Chinese going to the city. And if that is done properly, well, one way or the other, it's going to drive to an important extent global economic and environmental outcomes. Just no doubt about that. You could argue that is really the most important economic event of the next 25 years. And so what is it we do? We have pilot programs partnering with many U.S. companies, experts from around the world, organizations like McKinsey, working with Chinese mayors, a big emphasis on sustainability, a big emphasis on energy efficiency, and so there a big emphasis on the environment. We have conservation programs that deal with how do you conserve these critically important ecosystems in China and around the world, because although climate I see as just being a huge threat, and we're not going to solve it unless we really work together with China. Just the ecosystem more broadly and biodiversity is important. We have programs that deal with responsible executive leadership, working with CEOs and chairmen of big Chinese companies, because right now there are some huge companies domestically in China, but there aren't really many Chinese companies that are global leaders. And another trend you're going to see over the next 25 years or so, as these companies become global companies, they're going to need to develop their own systems of governance, disclosure, best environmental practices, training, how to give back to the communities in which they do business. And those companies are going to be the lens through which the rest of the world look at China. And then the other thing we work on big time is the economic relationship with China. And right now, when you look at the economic relationship with China, we have a just really robust trade relationship that's roughly, very big, roughly $500 million. And so it's a huge relationship for $500 billion. And so a big relationship. The exports to China are growing faster than to any other country in the world. And in terms of investing, U.S. companies have invested a lot in China. They haven't invested much in the U.S. They own roughly a trillion plus of our Treasury securities. And so what we need to do is take some of those investments that are in portfolio investments and get them into direct investments that create good U.S. jobs. And so we're doing work on programs in areas where it makes real business sense for the Chinese to invest and create jobs. And because we're not an investment bank, and we don't do mergers, and we don't make investments, we're a not-for-profit, what we've done is got groups of really good thinkers together from academia, from the business community in both countries, to try to target certain industries for further study that makes sense. The first industry we focused on was ag, because again, our largest market for our ag exports is China. We sell a lot of beans and corn to China, but we started to ask ourselves, and the Chinese did, wouldn't it be better if maybe they had some meat processing facilities here and created some U.S. jobs, and we sold more pork and beef to China. So anyway, we work on a range of programs.
So just last week, my wife and I were in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where one of the pork plants that the Chinese company has just bought was located. You mentioned something I have to ask you about, because I'm sure the same idea occurred to everybody in the room. When you were Treasury Secretary, did you ever worry about the scenario of the Chinese staging a run on the T-notes?
No. So here's a good way to think about the T-notes. And I get this question all the time. The Chinese are the largest investor, the largest foreign investor in our Treasury bills. They own a bit more than the Japanese or the British. They own, depending on how you count it, 12 to 15% of our treasuries. This represents 1/3 of their foreign exchange reserves. So this is important to us, but it's critically important to them. Much more important to them than it is to us. And so when people ask me was I was concerned, I'm concerned that we have so much debt. I'm concerned that I'm glad that the Chinese are investing in our treasuries. I would like to see them make more investments, direct investments that create jobs in the U.S.
So I have a policy question for you, which I'm going to use to lead to a personal question in some of our closing moments. A crucial emphasis of your personal work and the the Paulson Institute's work over the years has been in environment and sustainability. One could make a case in China that it really is going to be impossible to sort of move the needle in China because the needs for development are so intense, so many people coming into the cities, getting the gasoline to be cleaned up in Beijing is too costly, et cetera. What are reasons to think there can actually be positive leverage there on the Chinese environmental situation?
Well, that to me is the big question, because if you look at the story of the last 10 years, China has done extraordinary things in terms of their investment in clean technologies, in terms of shutting down dirty plants, and so on. But they've been losing the war. The environment, it's just been blown away by this rapid pace of growth. What makes me at least cautiously optimistic is that the Chinese people care so much, and the Chinese people are not going to accept the dirty air and the dirty water. So now the question is, what do they do about it? Because one of the issues I sort of shorthanded when I talked about the challenges that Xi Jinping has is they have good laws, but they don't have the real ability to enforce those laws in many areas. They don't have the institutions in place, and their Environmental Protection Agency doesn't have the resources it needs, and the environmental enforcement is left largely to the provincial leaders and the municipal leaders. And of course, that's a little bit like, in some cases, asking the fox to guard the chicken coop, because they're being judged on creating jobs and on economic growth. So the points that I make all the time, and people very much agree with, is the only way you're going to create real prosperity is on a long-term basis and with sustainable practices. But what they're going to need to do is be able to enforce the law. And I think there's two ways they're going to be able to do that. One is they're going to have to expand their capability to have the organizations like the Environmental Protection Agency enforce it, but then also through changing their performance evaluation systems. And I think that's going to become a much bigger criteria of success, and that it won't be possible for mayors and party secretaries to say, well, GDP grew X%, but don't worry about the environment. So I think they're focused on it. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be a big focus. And the way I look at it is that if you care about the global environment and you care about climate, and you have some experience that I have in working with China, well, then I'm going to work on it, even if I think it's a big challenge.
And just one more, how many people here have been to Beijing during one of the bad pollution days in the past year or so? And an informed audience. Last visit I made, the International School of Beijing has put an airlock over its playing field so that kids can go outdoors to exercise. My contention is that this actually is the main threat to the stability of the regime. Do you agree, and do you think they agree? That pollution, birth defect epidemics, cancer epidemics, this is not sustainable.
Yeah, I would say, if you would say, what are the threats? The biggest point of unrest is still the property rights, because the municipal finance, they need municipal finance system. Mayors don't really have adequate authorities, budget authorities. They don't have transparent budgets, and what they do is they fund their growth by taking land from the farmers and selling it, and that leads to urban sprawl. So that's a big area. Corruption's a big area, but very fast, the environment is becoming the biggest. People aren't wanting to live in Beijing. If you're successful and you can afford to live elsewhere, it's difficult to subject your families to that air. And so this is a problem in a number of areas in China. And of course, this goes hand in glove with the other issue they have, is they have 300 migrants in China living in the cities that have left their homes in the farm but without legal status, and so they don't have the same economic benefits, education benefits, opportunities. And so this winter, a lot of them were forced to burn dirty coal to stay warm. So you can't just, that's why I said the challenges are going to have to figure out how to sequence these reforms. They can't just normalize the labor market, or everybody will be in Beijing all at once. And so it's going to take a balanced approach, but I do agree with you that the environment is a huge area of focus.
We just have a few minutes left. I wanted to see if we could close on an Aspen-style question. This institution is a monument to examining policy and issues, but also the examined life and the ways to live a life. Most people in this crowd and listening to this discussion are not going to be secretaries of the Treasury. They're not going to be Goldman Sachs chairmen. They're not going to be traveling back and forth to China the way you are or have the direct influence. If people agreed with you about the importance of U.S.-China relations or about the importance of environmental sustainability, what would you like them to do or think or support?
Well, first of all, let's deal with U.S.-China. Basically, there's going to be, our relationship with China is inevitably going to be a mixture of competition and cooperation. I probably should have said cooperation first and competition, but it will be. So the key question is going to be, what is going to be the mixture of the two? What's going to be the nature of that cooperation? And how are we going to manage the competition so it doesn't devolve into something that's really unhealthy? And so a lot of this is going to be the decisions our leaders make, but there's always going to be tensions between Washington and Beijing, given what the issue is at the time. So key is going to be the people-to-people relationships, the understanding. If people understand each other, it's very hard to have the same kind of conflict. It's much easier to cooperate. So to me, when I talk to groups and they say, what can they do? They can learn about China. They can travel to China. They can get to know Chinese visitors here. And in terms of the environment, it's a little bit like my wife tells me all the time. When early on, years ago, when she was demanding that I recycle. And if I threw something in the trash, she was fishing it out and making me fish it out, and so on. And because she said it's important to set a good example. So I think that's why our climate strategy and climate policy is important here. You could argue that, listen, our energy efficiency is increasing, our climate emissions are going down as a percentage of GDP. China's are increasing. What we do here is insignificant compared to what happens in China. But I do believe that we need to be, that it's just highly important that our two countries work together. We need innovative policies, processes, financing, for clean technologies and environmental technologies. And we couldn't be more complementary, because no one innovates like we do in the U.S. Look at our research universities, look at our national labs, our companies, our innovators, our legal and financing infrastructure, and no one rolls out, can go to production more quickly on a large-scale basis, which you have to do, than China. And given the fact that China's energy market is growing so fast, what a great place to test new technologies. And so, but it's hard for us to do this unless we're setting the example ourselves, and unless we have a national climate policy. So we need to be leaders, and then all of us need to be leaders individually. So.
Thank you. Thank you. So the main way in which I have changed my mind about China in the past 7 years of largely being there is the importance of these person-to-person ties. I do think they really matter. You've set a wonderful example in the business world, the public world, and the civic world for doing that. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.